On the afternoon of June 20th, 2019, a classified mission room within the Operations Center at Fort George G. Meade, Maryland, monitored real-time intrusion sequences targeting Iranian Aerospace Force Group command and control infrastructure deep within hardened facilities near Bandar Abbas Naval Base. Intelligence operators working under the Joint Task Force Computer Network Operations Directive observed digital intrusion protocols penetrating fire control networks belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, systematically disabling missile coordination systems that Tehran's strategic planners believed to be invulnerable due to air-gap isolation from external networks. The operation, authorized directly by the National Command Authority following the downing of a U.S. Navy RQ-4A Global Hawk reconnaissance drone over the Strait of Hormuz, represented the culmination of a 15-year strategic investment in offensive cyber warfare capabilities designed to achieve what traditional kinetic strikes could not. The preemptive neutralization of adversary weapon systems without firing a single shot, without losing aircraft, without ground troops crossing hostile borders, and without creating the catastrophic escalation dynamics that characterized 20th-century great power confrontations. What Iranian commanders discovered in the hours following the American cyber intrusion was that their most sophisticated anti-ship cruise missiles, their coastal defense batteries, and their ballistic missile launch platforms had been rendered operationally inert by invisible digital weapons that had been silently residing within their networks for months, perhaps years, waiting for remote activation commands transmitted from thousands of miles away. The realization forced a fundamental reassessment of strategic vulnerability within Tehran's general staff. If the Americans could disable launch systems at will, then Iran's entire deterrence posture, built on the credible threat of asymmetric retaliation, had been quietly dismantled without a single explosion, without radar detection, without diplomatic protest opportunities that conventional military strikes would have generated. The conceptual foundation for offensive cyber warfare against missile systems emerged not from Silicon Valley innovation labs or academic computer science departments, but from the strategic deliberations of defense planners who had spent decades contemplating the vulnerabilities inherent in increasingly networked military infrastructure. During the height of the Cold War, targeting specialists within the U.S. Strategic Air Command understood that Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile silos depended on hardened communications lines, mechanical firing sequences, and redundant manual override systems specifically designed to prevent external interference with launch authority chains. The technological architecture of Soviet strategic forces during the 1970s and 1980s reflected deep institutional paranoia about Western electronic warfare capabilities, resulting in weapons systems deliberately isolated from telecommunications networks and protected by multiple layers of physical security protocols that made remote manipulation effectively impossible. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent proliferation of digital technologies throughout global military establishments created unforeseen strategic opportunities for nations possessing advanced signals intelligence infrastructure and offensive cyber capabilities. By the early 2000s, military forces in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and dozens of other nations had integrated networked computer systems into fire control algorithms, early warning radar coordination platforms, satellite communications architectures, and missile guidance update sequences that previous generations of weapons designers had deliberately kept analog precisely to prevent the kind of remote interference that American cyber warfare planners were now developing as a central component of 21st-century strategic doctrine. The institutional architecture required to execute sustained offensive cyber operations against adversary military networks took shape gradually between 2000 and 2009, emerging from organizational structures within the National Security Agency that had previously focused exclusively on signals intelligence collection rather than active network intrusion and manipulation. Tailored Access Operations, a specialized division within the NSA's Signals Intelligence Directorate, had been conducting targeted intrusions into foreign computer networks since the mid-1990s, but these missions remained primarily focused on intelligence gathering rather than operational disruption or weapons system sabotage. The technical specialists working within TAO's Remote Operations Center at Fort Meade developed sophisticated exploitation tools capable of penetrating hardened networks through supply chain interdiction, firmware manipulation, and zero-day vulnerability exploitation in commercial software platforms used by foreign military establishments. These capabilities remained largely theoretical as offensive weapons, until senior defense officials began contemplating the strategic implications of left-of-launch missile defense concepts that would disable adversary weapons before they could be fired, rather than attempting to intercept them during flight using kinetic interceptors with uncertain success rates. The strategic logic was compelling. If American cyber operators could infiltrate command and control networks governing missile launch sequences, then billions of dollars invested in terminal-phase ballistic missile defense systems might be rendered redundant by invisible digital sabotage that prevented launches from occurring in the first place. But translating this concept from PowerPoint presentations in the Pentagon to operational reality required solving extraordinary technical challenges involving air-gapped networks, proprietary industrial control systems, and adversary counterintelligence protocols specifically designed to detect and neutralize foreign intrusion attempts. The operational proof of concept for offensive cyber warfare against air-gapped military-industrial networks arrived in June 2010, when industrial control engineers at Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility discovered that their IR-1 centrifuges were failing at statistically impossible rates despite operating within normal environmental parameters and receiving proper maintenance according to manufacturer specifications. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which had installed monitoring cameras inside the centrifuge halls as part of Tehran's Nuclear Safeguards Agreement, documented the systematic replacement of damaged centrifuges, but attributed the failures to Iranian technical inexperience with advanced uranium enrichment processes rather than external sabotage. What IAEA inspectors did not yet understand was that a sophisticated computer worm, later designated Stuxnet, had been introduced into the facility's control networks through infected USB drives, possibly delivered through supply chain interdiction or inserted by intelligence operatives with temporary physical access to Natanz support facilities. The malware remained dormant within the facility's Windows-based supervisory control systems until it detected specific Siemens S7300 programmable logic controllers configured to operate centrifuges at precisely 1064 Hz, the exact operational frequency of Iran's IR-1 centrifuge cascade configuration. Once activated, Stuxnet injected false operational commands into the PLCs, first increasing rotational velocity to 1410 Hz for 15 minutes to induce structural stress within the aluminum centrifuge tubes, then reducing speed to 2 Hz for 50 minutes to create catastrophic mechanical imbalance, before returning to normal operational parameters to avoid immediate detection. Simultaneously, the malware installed a rootkit within the SCADA monitoring systems that fed false telemetry data to Iranian engineers, convincing them that centrifuges were operating normally even as they were being systematically destroyed by digitally induced mechanical failure. The technical sophistication embedded within Stuxnet revealed capabilities that could only have been developed by nation-state actors possessing detailed intelligence about Iranian centrifuge configurations, access to actual Siemens industrial control hardware for testing purposes, an advanced understanding of uranium enrichment physics sufficient to calibrate sabotage algorithms that would destroy centrifuges while maintaining plausible deniability by mimicking natural mechanical failure modes. Subsequent forensic analysis conducted by cybersecurity researchers at Symantec and Kaspersky Lab identified multiple zero-day vulnerabilities exploited by the worm, including previously unknown security flaws in Windows operating systems and Siemens Step 7 industrial control software that would have required extraordinary resources to discover and weaponize. The malware's modular architecture suggested collaborative development between signals intelligence specialists familiar with network intrusion techniques and weapons systems engineers who understood centrifuge physics and control algorithms. Most significantly, Stuxnet demonstrated that air-gapped networks, long considered the ultimate defense against remote cyber intrusion, could be penetrated and manipulated through carefully orchestrated supply chain operations, social engineering targeting facility personnel, or direct physical access by intelligence operatives. For military planners contemplating offensive cyber operations against missile launch facilities, early warning radar networks, or fire control systems protected by air gap isolation, The Iranian centrifuge sabotage provided operational proof that no network was truly secure if an adversary possessed sufficient technical sophistication, intelligence preparation, and willingness to invest years developing intrusion vectors tailored to specific target environments. The formal establishment of United States Cyber Command in May 2010, concurrent with the Stuxnet operations execution phase, signaled the Pentagon's institutional commitment to offensive cyber warfare as a core component of American military doctrine rather than an experimental intelligence collection methodology. The new Unified Combatant Command, headquartered at Fort Meade and initially led by the Director of the National Security Agency, received authority to conduct both defensive and offensive cyber operations across the full spectrum of military contingencies from peacetime network defense to large-scale combat operations. The dual-hatted command structure, with the USCYBRCOM commander simultaneously serving as NSA director, reflected deliberate organizational design intended to integrate signals intelligence collection capabilities with offensive operational planning in ways that previous organizational structures had prevented. But the command's initial operational focus remained primarily defensive, protecting Department of Defense information networks against foreign intrusion while developing the organizational frameworks, training pipelines, and operational doctrine required to project offensive cyber effects against adversary military infrastructure. The Cyber Mission Force, eventually structured to include 6,200 specialized personnel organized into cyber national mission teams, focused on defending critical national infrastructure and cyber combat mission teams aligned with geographic and functional combatant commands, required nearly a decade to reach full operational capability as the military services struggled to recruit, train, and retain personnel with advanced technical skills in an environment where private sector technology companies offered substantially higher compensation for similar expertise. The strategic doctrine governing offensive cyber operations evolved through intensive classified debates within the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and the intelligence community regarding the legal authorities, operational constraints, and escalation dynamics associated with digital weapons that operated in fundamentally different ways than kinetic military strikes. Traditional concepts of deterrence, developed during the nuclear age and predicated on assured retaliation and mutual vulnerability, translated imperfectly to cyber warfare where attribution remained uncertain. Proportional response calculations became ambiguous, and the distinction between intelligence collection and operational attack existed along a continuous spectrum rather than as discrete categories. Defense Department cyber warfare doctrine, gradually declassified through the 2010s in heavily redacted operational concept documents, emphasized the integration of offensive cyber operations with traditional kinetic strikes and information operations to achieve combined effects that neither capability could accomplish independently. The concept of defending forward, articulated most explicitly in the 2018 National Cyber Strategy, authorized persistent engagement with adversary networks during peacetime to map vulnerabilities, establish operational access, and position digital weapons within adversary command and control infrastructure before conflicts began. This represented a fundamental shift from reactive cyber defense, responding to intrusions after they occurred, to proactive operational preparation that normalized peacetime intrusion activities as legitimate military reconnaissance and preparation of the battle space. The technical methodologies required to penetrate air-gapped military networks evolved substantially between the Stuxnet operation and the full operationalization of offensive cyber warfare capabilities in the late 2010s, driven by adversary defensive adaptations and the proliferation of increasingly sophisticated security protocols within foreign military establishments. Intelligence assessments circulated within the defense community during the mid-2010s indicated that Russian, Chinese, and Iranian military planners had implemented aggressive air-gapping initiatives following revelations about American cyber intrusion capabilities, physically isolating missile command and control networks, early warning radar coordination systems, and strategic communications platforms from any external connectivity, including ostensibly secure military internet protocols. These defensive measures forced American cyber warfare planners to develop multi-vector intrusion strategies combining signals intelligence collection, supply chain interdiction, electromagnetic emanation exploitation, and human intelligence operations targeting facility personnel with access to isolated networks. Classified capability assessments produced by NSA's Tailored Access Operations Division during this period identified specific intrusion vectors, including compromised firmware embedded in commercial hardware components purchased by foreign militaries, malware prepositioned on USB drives and maintenance laptops used by contractors servicing isolated military networks, and sophisticated electromagnetic eavesdropping techniques capable of intercepting data from air-gapped systems through analysis of unintentional radio frequency emissions generated by computer processors and display systems. The operational deployment of these capabilities against North Korean ballistic missile infrastructure during the mid-2010s provided the first sustained test of offensive cyber warfare's ability to disrupt adversary strategic weapons programs through persistent digital interference, rather than one-time sabotage operations. Following North Korea's accelerated ballistic missile testing program beginning in 2012, President Barack Obama reportedly directed the intelligence community and Department of Defense to infiltrate Pyongyang's missile development and testing infrastructure with the objective of increasing failure rates and undermining confidence in the weapons systems North Korean leadership was developing as strategic deterrence against American military intervention. Subsequent analysis of North Korean missile test failures during this period identified statistically anomalous patterns suggesting systematic sabotage rather than natural technical difficulties, including guidance system failures that sent missiles off course shortly after launch, engine malfunctions that occurred at suspiciously consistent intervals across different missile types, and telemetry disruptions that prevented North Korean engineers from collecting critical performance data needed to improve subsequent designs. While definitive attribution remained classified, the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested sustained cyber intrusion into North Korean missile development networks, possibly including sabotage of industrial control systems at component manufacturing facilities, manipulation of design specifications within engineering databases, and interference with telemetry collection systems that prevented engineers from diagnosing problems with failed tests. The strategic implications of successful cyber sabotage against ballistic missile development programs extended far beyond the specific operational effects achieved against North Korean testing infrastructure. For the first time, American defense planners possessed capabilities to systematically degrade adversary strategic weapons programs through invisible digital operations that created ambiguity about failure causes and prevented adversary engineers from distinguishing between legitimate technical problems and deliberate sabotage. This ambiguity represented a critical strategic advantage. Traditional kinetic strikes against missile facilities generated immediate international responses and provided adversaries with clear evidence of American military action requiring retaliation or diplomatic response, while cyber sabotage operations could remain unacknowledged and unattributable, leaving adversary leadership uncertain whether weapons failures resulted from sabotage, espionage-induced design flaws, or genuine technical inadequacy within their defense industrial base. The psychological and strategic effects of this uncertainty potentially exceeded the direct operational damage caused by specific sabotage operations, as adversary military planners confronted the possibility that their entire weapons development process had been comprehensively penetrated by American intelligence services capable of manipulating every stage from initial design through final deployment. The doctrinal integration of offensive cyber capabilities into comprehensive strategic planning received significant impetus following the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea and subsequent military intervention in eastern Ukraine, operations that demonstrated how technologically sophisticated adversaries could combine cyber warfare, information operations, and conventional military force to achieve strategic objectives while remaining below thresholds that would trigger large-scale Western military responses. Russian military doctrine articulated during this period emphasized reflexive control concepts that used information warfare and cyber operations to manipulate adversary decision-making processes and create strategic paralysis during critical phases of military operations. Western military analysis of Russian operations in Ukraine identified specific instances where cyber attacks against Ukrainian power infrastructure, telecommunications networks, and military command systems preceded or coincided with conventional military operations, degrading Ukrainian defensive capabilities and creating confusion that Russian forces exploited during ground operations. These observations reinforced growing recognition within the Pentagon that future conflicts involving peer or near-peer adversaries would inevitably include extensive cyber warfare components integrated with conventional operations from conflict initiation rather than as supplementary activities. The operational framework for integrating offensive cyber effects into combined arms warfare emerged through intensive exercises and planning efforts conducted by USCYBRCOM and the Geographic Combatant Commands throughout the late 2010s. Classified war games conducted during this period explored scenarios where American cyber operators would preemptively disable adversary integrated air defense systems through network intrusion and manipulation, creating corridors for stealth aircraft penetration without requiring extensive suppression of enemy air defense missions using conventional anti-radiation missiles. Similar planning efforts examined cyber operations against adversary command and control networks designed to create strategic confusion during the opening hours of conflict, severing communications between national leadership and forward military units, while feeding false information through compromised networks to induce tactical errors. Most significantly for strategic deterrence calculations, planning efforts focused extensively on offensive cyber operations against adversary missile launch facilities, with the objective of preventing ballistic missile launches during conflict escalation phases before nuclear thresholds could be crossed. The strategic logic underpinning these capabilities rested on the premise that preemptive cyber disablement of adversary strategic weapons represented a less escalatory option than kinetic strikes against missile facilities, while achieving similar operational effects of preventing adversary nuclear employment. However, this strategic logic confronted fundamental challenges that became increasingly apparent through sustained analysis by defense planners and academic strategists examining cyber warfare's implications for crisis stability and escalation dynamics. British defense analysts at Chatham House published detailed assessments in 2019 warning that left-of-launch cyber operations against missile systems could actually increase rather than decrease the likelihood of adversary weapons employment by creating use-it-or-lose-it pressures during crisis situations. If adversary leadership believed that American cyber capabilities could disable their strategic missile forces at will, they might conclude that launching weapons preemptively during crisis escalation represented the only means of maintaining credible deterrence before American cyber operations rendered their forces inoperable. This dynamic directly contradicted the strategic stability concepts that had governed nuclear deterrence throughout the Cold War, where assured second strike capabilities and mutual vulnerability created powerful incentives against preemptive attack. By potentially giving American leadership confidence that adversary strategic forces could be neutralized through cyber operations without kinetic engagement, offensive cyber warfare capabilities might paradoxically increase crisis instability by undermining adversary confidence in their deterrent forces and creating incentives for rapid escalation before digital weapons could be fully employed. The operational reality of executing sustained offensive cyber campaigns against defended military networks also presented significant challenges that theoretical capability discussions often understated. Unlike the Stuxnet operation, which benefited from years of preparation against a specific static target with limited counterintelligence capabilities, offensive cyber operations against peer adversary military networks confronted sophisticated defensive architectures specifically designed to detect, isolate, and neutralize foreign intrusion attempts. Russian and Chinese military networks implemented aggressive counterintelligence protocols including comprehensive network segmentation, continuous behavioral analysis to identify anomalous activity patterns, deceptive honeypot networks designed to identify intrusion techniques, and offensive counter-cyber capabilities intended to conduct immediate retaliatory attacks against detected intrusion sources. The sustained access required to position cyber weapons within adversary missile command and control networks months or years before their employment necessitated extraordinary operational security and technical sophistication to avoid detection and removal. Even successfully positioned cyberweapons confronted significant operational uncertainty. Malware that functioned perfectly during peacetime network reconnaissance might fail when activated during actual conflict due to adversary defensive adaptations, network configuration changes, or deliberate deception measures that provided false confidence in successful intrusion while routing critical military functions through uncompromised parallel networks. The organizational maturation of American offensive cyber warfare capabilities accelerated substantially during the late 2010s, as USCYBRCOM transitioned from primarily defensive focus to full-spectrum offensive operational capability. The command's first acknowledged large-scale offensive cyber campaign, Operation Glowing Symphony, conducted between 2016 and 2017 against Islamic State media infrastructure, provided operational experience in sustained network intrusion and disruption operations, but against a technologically unsophisticated adversary lacking significant counterintelligence capabilities. USCYBRCOM's assessment of the operation, partially declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests in 2020, acknowledged that Glowing Symphony represented the most complex offensive cyberspace operation USCYBRCOM has conducted to date, while simultaneously noting significant challenges in operational synchronization, deconfliction with kinetic targeting, and interagency coordination that would require resolution before offensive cyber operations could be effectively integrated into large-scale combat operations against peer adversaries. The transition from counterterrorism-focused cyber operations to preparations for potential conflicts with technologically sophisticated nation-state adversaries necessitated comprehensive expansion of the cyber mission force, development of advanced training infrastructure, and cultivation of operational relationships with the geographic combatant commands that would employ cyber effects in support of theater campaign plans. The strategic messaging surrounding American offensive cyber warfare capabilities evolved substantially during the transition from the Obama administration's deliberate ambiguity regarding cyber operations to more explicit acknowledgement of offensive capabilities during the Trump administration. The 2018 Department of Defense Cyber Strategy publicly acknowledged that the United States possessed offensive cyber capabilities and would employ them proactively to defend forward and contest adversary operations in cyberspace during peacetime rather than waiting for conflict initiation. This shift toward greater transparency regarding offensive capabilities reflected evolving strategic thinking about cyber deterrence that paralleled historical debates regarding nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. Defense strategists argued that adversary uncertainty regarding American cyber warfare capabilities potentially undermined rather than enhanced deterrence by preventing adversary leadership from fully comprehending the costs and consequences of actions that might trigger American cyber retaliation. By more explicitly acknowledging offensive capabilities while maintaining appropriate operational security regarding specific technical methodologies and targeting, American defense officials sought to achieve deterrent effects through demonstrated capability and expressed willingness to employ cyber weapons in defense of national interests. The reported cyber operations against Iranian missile command and control networks following the June 2019 shootdown of the American reconnaissance drone represented a significant implementation of this strategy, with multiple authoritative press accounts describing the operations in sufficient detail to signal American offensive capabilities, while maintaining classification of specific intrusion vectors and technical exploitation methodologies. The Iranian operations' strategic significance extended beyond their immediate operational effects of temporarily disabling specific missile systems to their demonstration of American willingness to employ offensive cyber weapons at the strategic level against a technologically capable adversary with significant counterintelligence resources. Unlike the Stuxnet operation, which remained officially unacknowledged for years despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence of American and Israeli involvement, the June 2019 cyber strikes received semi-official confirmation through attributed press reporting clearly sourced to senior defense and intelligence officials. This deliberate signaling represented strategic communication intended to shape adversary perceptions of American cyber warfare capabilities and willingness to employ them in response to provocations. Iranian military planners confronted the uncomfortable realization that their most sophisticated weapon systems, despite air-gap isolation and comprehensive security protocols, remained vulnerable to American cyber intrusion capabilities that had apparently been positioned within their networks long before the immediate crisis that triggered their activation. The implications for strategic planning were profound. If American cyber operators possessed persistent access to Iranian missile command and control networks, then Tehran's entire deterrence strategy based on credible threats of asymmetric retaliation against American forces and regional allies had been quietly undermined by invisible digital weapons that could disable launch capabilities at will. The proliferation of American offensive cyber warfare methodologies to other technologically sophisticated nations created concerning dynamics for international strategic stability during the early 2020s. Russian military doctrine explicitly incorporated offensive cyber operations as integral components of combined arms warfare, with demonstrated capabilities including attacks against Ukrainian power infrastructure and attacks against Georgian government networks timed to coincide with conventional military operations. Chinese military writings on intelligentized warfare emphasized integration of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced cyber capabilities to achieve information dominance over adversaries during future conflicts. Israeli cyber warfare capabilities, demonstrated through sustained operations against Iranian nuclear infrastructure and regional adversary military networks, reflected comprehensive national investment in offensive cyber technologies comparable to American programs. The emergence of multiple peer competitors possessing sophisticated offensive cyber warfare capabilities created strategic environments fundamentally different from the Cold War bipolar nuclear confrontation, where multiple actors possessed weapons that operated with ambiguous attribution, uncertain proportionality, and potential for rapid inadvertent escalation through misperception or miscalculation. The technical evolution of adversary defensive capabilities during the early 2020s forced continuous adaptation of American offensive cyber warfare methodologies to maintain operational effectiveness against increasingly sophisticated security architectures. Chinese military networks implemented comprehensive zero-trust security models that assumed persistent adversary presence within networks and required continuous authentication and behavioral analysis for all network activities regardless of apparent source authorization. Russian military communications increasingly relied on proprietary encryption protocols and domestically produced hardware specifically designed to prevent exploitation through supply chain interdiction or firmware manipulation. Iranian military establishments dramatically expanded air-gapping initiatives and implemented aggressive physical security protocols limiting personnel access to isolated networks. These defensive adaptations necessitated American investment in increasingly sophisticated intrusion capabilities, including advanced electromagnetic exploitation techniques, quantum computing applications for cryptographic attacks, artificial intelligence-enabled malware capable of autonomous adaptation to defensive countermeasures, and expanded human intelligence operations targeting personnel with access to isolated adversary military networks. The operational integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities into offensive cyber warfare tools represented particularly significant technical evolution during the early 2020s. Traditional cyber intrusion methodologies required extensive human operator involvement in network reconnaissance, vulnerability exploitation, lateral movement through compromised networks, and payload delivery against ultimate targets. AI-enabled malware possessed capabilities for autonomous network mapping, adaptive exploitation of identified vulnerabilities, intelligent evasion of defensive countermeasures, and real-time operational adjustment based on observed defensive responses. These capabilities dramatically reduced the operational timeline from initial network penetration to achievement of strategic effects, while simultaneously complicating defensive attribution by creating attack patterns that appeared superficially similar to activities by multiple different adversaries. The integration of AI capabilities into cyber weapons also raised significant strategic concerns about autonomous decision-making in offensive operations, particularly regarding weapons positioned within adversary nuclear command and control networks, where malware malfunction or autonomous activation without proper human authorization could trigger catastrophic escalation dynamics. The organizational structure supporting offensive cyber warfare operations expanded substantially beyond USCYBRCOM to encompass classified activities conducted by the intelligence community, particularly the national security agencies' tailored access operations and computer network operations divisions. These organizations, operating under different legal authorities than military cyber operations, conducted sustained intrusion campaigns against adversary military networks during peacetime to establish operational access, map network architectures, identify vulnerabilities, and position tools for potential future activation if authorized by national leadership. The legal and organizational distinctions between intelligence collection activities and offensive cyber operations existed more clearly in policy documents than in operational reality, as the technical actions required to conduct comprehensive network reconnaissance were often indistinguishable from preparatory activities for offensive operations. This ambiguity reflected broader challenges in cyber warfare policy, where the distinction between espionage and attack existed along a continuous spectrum rather than as discrete categories separable by clear legal or operational boundaries. The strategic implications of American offensive cyber warfare capabilities for long-term deterrence relationships with peer competitors remained actively debated within defense policy communities during the mid-2020s. Proponents argued that demonstrated capabilities to preemptively disable adversary strategic weapons systems enhanced deterrence by confronting adversary leadership with credible threats of decisive American military advantage that would prevent achievement of adversary strategic objectives through military force. This perspective emphasized cyber warfare capabilities as fundamentally defensive instruments that prevented conflicts by convincing adversaries that military aggression could not succeed. Critics countered that offensive cyber capabilities against strategic weapons systems potentially undermine crisis stability by creating incentives for rapid escalation, encouraged adversary development of comparable offensive capabilities in destabilizing arms race dynamics, and created dangerous overconfidence among American policymakers regarding the reliability of cyber weapons, whose effectiveness remained fundamentally uncertain until actual employment in combat conditions against defended adversary networks. This debate paralleled historical strategic discussions regarding ballistic missile defense, where similar arguments emerged regarding whether defensive capabilities enhanced or undermined strategic stability, depending on their effectiveness and adversary perceptions of their capabilities. The operational realities documented through classified after-action assessments of cyber warfare operations conducted during the late 2010s and early 2020s suggested significant gaps between theoretical capability claims and demonstrated operational effects. USCYBRCOM's partially declassified assessment of Operation Glowing Symphony acknowledged that the operation imposed time and resource costs on Islamic State propaganda operations, but did not achieve decisive strategic effects in disrupting the organization's information operations. Subsequent operations against more sophisticated adversaries confronted substantially greater challenges, including robust defensive countermeasures, rapid adversary adaptation to identified intrusion vectors, and significant operational security challenges in maintaining persistent access to defended networks over extended periods. Intelligence community assessments of adversary cyber warfare capabilities produced during this period indicated that Russian, Chinese, and Iranian military networks possessed comparable defensive sophistication to American networks, suggesting that confident assumptions about unilateral American offensive cyber superiority potentially underestimated adversary capabilities for defensive resilience and offensive retaliation. The integration of offensive cyber warfare capabilities into theater campaign planning by the Geographic Combatant Commands accelerated during the early 2020s as USCYBRCOM achieved full operational capability and established formal operational relationships with regional military commands. Indo-Pacific Command developed extensive planning for cyber operations against Chinese integrated air defense networks, satellite communications infrastructure, and naval command and control systems that would support conventional military operations during potential conflicts over Taiwan or South China Sea contingencies. European commands similarly integrated cyber effects into operational plans for deterring or responding to potential Russian military aggression against NATO member states. Central Command incorporated cyber operations against Iranian missile systems, naval coordination networks, and proxy force command infrastructure into contingency planning for potential conflicts in the Persian Gulf region. These planning efforts reflected comprehensive integration of cyber warfare into joint operational concepts rather than treatment of cyber operations as supplementary or supporting activities conducted separately from conventional military operations. The technical sophistication required for successful offensive cyber operations against defended military networks necessitated extraordinary investments in specialized personnel, advanced technological development, and sustained intelligence collection to maintain comprehensive understanding of adversary network architectures and defensive capabilities. The cyber mission force's expansion to 6,200 personnel represented only the most visible component of a substantially larger enterprise encompassing intelligence collectors, tool developers, supply chain interdiction specialists, and targeting analysts distributed across multiple defense and intelligence agencies. Training pipelines required multiple years to produce fully qualified cyber operators capable of conducting sophisticated intrusion operations against defended adversary networks, creating significant challenges for force expansion and reconstitution. The highly specialized nature of offensive cyber warfare expertise created strategic vulnerabilities where loss of key personnel through retirement, private sector recruitment, or counterintelligence compromise could significantly degrade operational capabilities in ways that traditional military force structure attrition would not. The strategic messaging challenges associated with offensive cyber warfare capabilities remained significant throughout the mid-2020s, as defense policymakers sought to achieve deterrent effects through capability signaling, while maintaining operational security regarding specific technical methodologies. The traditional approach of demonstrating military capabilities through public exercises, weapons tests, and operational deployments translated poorly to cyber warfare, where revealing specific intrusion vectors or exploitation techniques enabled adversary defensive adaptations that could render those capabilities obsolete. Defense officials adopted carefully calibrated disclosure strategies that acknowledged general offensive capabilities and demonstrated willingness to employ cyber weapons, while maintaining classification of specific tools and operational methodologies. Authorized disclosures to trusted journalists provided sufficient detail to achieve strategic messaging effects while preserving operational security for actual cyber warfare tools and techniques. This approach paralleled historical nuclear weapons policies, where general capability disclosure served deterrent purposes, while specific technical details regarding weapons designs and operational employment plans remained highly classified. The long-term evolution of international norms regarding cyber warfare remained highly contested during the mid-2020s despite sustained diplomatic efforts to establish agreed constraints on peacetime cyber operations and limitations on targeting of critical civilian infrastructure. Russian and Chinese diplomatic initiatives at the United Nations proposed treaties that would prohibit offensive cyber operations during peacetime and establish international inspection regimes for verification. But these proposals confronted fundamental challenges in verification methodology and definitional precision that made meaningful arms control agreements extremely difficult to negotiate. American diplomatic approaches emphasized development of voluntary norms regarding responsible state behavior in cyberspace rather than formal treaties, arguing that the rapidly evolving technical nature of cyber capabilities made traditional arms control frameworks inappropriate. This diplomatic deadlock reflected deeper strategic tensions, where major powers possessed significant asymmetric advantages in cyber warfare capabilities that they were reluctant to constrain through international agreements, while simultaneously expressing concern about adversary cyber operations that threaten their own vulnerable networks and critical infrastructure. The operational employment of offensive cyber warfare capabilities during the mid-2020s occurred primarily through sustained below-threshold activities that remained largely invisible to public observation despite achieving significant strategic effects. Defense officials occasionally referenced cyber operations in general terms when discussing American responses to adversary provocations, but detailed public accounting of specific operations remained rare due to classification concerns and diplomatic sensitivities. The strategic impact of these operations manifested through adversary behavioral changes rather than visible battlefield effects. As adversary military establishments invested heavily in defensive cybersecurity, modified operational procedures to reduce digital vulnerabilities, and demonstrated increased caution regarding military activities that might trigger American cyber retaliation. These behavioral adaptations suggested that offensive cyber warfare capabilities were achieving deterrent effects even when not employed in highly visible strategic operations. The doctrinal maturation of cyber warfare concepts during the mid-2020s reflected hard-learned operational lessons regarding the limitations and challenges associated with offensive cyber operations against defended adversary networks. Updated defense doctrine acknowledged that cyber weapons functioned most effectively when integrated with conventional military operations rather than as standalone strategic instruments. That sustained operational access to adversary networks required continuous effort and adaptation rather than one-time intrusion. And that cyber warfare effectiveness remained fundamentally dependent on comprehensive intelligence preparation that could require years of sustained collection before operational employment became feasible. These doctrinal refinements reflected transition from initial enthusiasm about cyber warfare as revolutionary strategic capability to more measured assessments recognizing both significant potential and substantial operational limitations. The strategic landscape for offensive cyber warfare evolved continuously as adversaries developed increasingly sophisticated defensive capabilities, while simultaneously building their own offensive tools for potential retaliation against American networks and critical infrastructure. This dynamic created security dilemma effects, where American offensive capabilities motivated adversary defensive investments and reciprocal offensive development, producing arms race dynamics without the stabilizing transparency and verification mechanisms that characterized Cold War nuclear arms control. The resulting strategic environment featured multiple sophisticated cyber warfare actors possessing significant offensive capabilities, persistent mutual intrusion into each other's military and intelligence networks, and continuous technological competition to develop exploitation capabilities faster than adversaries could implement defensive countermeasures. The final assessment of offensive cyber warfare's impact on strategic stability and military effectiveness remained necessarily provisional, as the field continued rapid evolution and actual large-scale employment against peer adversary networks in high-intensity conflict conditions remained hypothetical. What was certain was that cyber warfare had fundamentally transformed strategic military planning, created new vulnerabilities in weapon systems previously considered secure, and generated novel deterrence dynamics that complicated crisis management and escalation control. American investment in offensive cyber warfare capabilities reflected calculated strategic judgment that technological superiority in this domain provided significant military advantages, while creating risks of inadvertent escalation and strategic instability that required careful management through doctrine, operational constraints, and continuous diplomatic engagement regarding international norms. The invisible nature of cyber warfare operations ensured that most strategic effects occurred far from public view, but their cumulative impact on adversary military confidence and American strategic flexibility represented one of the most significant developments in 21st century warfare, fundamentally altering calculations about deterrence, preemption, and the balance between offense and defense that had structured strategic thinking throughout the nuclear age.